My name is Rick Anderson. I'm Associate Dean for Collections and Scholarly Communication in the Library at the University of Utah. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping items really quick, and then I'll explain how our program is going to work. So first of all, please do silence your devices, and also please be aware that this session is being recorded. And what that means is that when you do ask a question or make a comment during the discussion portion of the program, please make sure you use one of the microphones provided. You may have a really good, strong voice and be confident that you can make yourself heard in the room, but be aware that not everybody hears equally well, and also that those who watch this recording later will not hear what you say unless you say it into the mic. And when you do make a comment, please also state your name and your affiliation if you feel comfortable doing that. Now, we want this discussion to be not only lively, but also respectful, so please help us out in that regard. So both we as an audience and our debaters today are going to be responding to the following proposition. Resolved, preprint servers have improved the scholarly communication ecosystem. And before I introduce our two debaters, I'm going to quickly explain how the debate itself is going to unfold. So first, all of us physically present in the auditorium are going to be invited to vote either in favor of or against the proposition, and the vote will then be recorded. Then we'll hear from Oya Rieger, who will give a 10-minute statement in favor of the resolution. She'll be followed by Kent Anderson, who will give a 10-minute statement in opposition to it. Oya will then give a 3-minute response to Kent, and Kent will then give a 3-minute response to Oya. Following the formal statements and responses, we'll open up the floor to discussion. After the discussion period, we'll invite those who are in the audience to vote again, asking that only those who participated in the initial vote also participate in the second vote. And then the debater who moves the most votes will be declared the winner. So let's open up the proposition to the initial vote. So on the screen, you'll see instructions for registering your vote either by text message or on the web. So while your votes are being registered, let me introduce our debaters. So Oya Rieger is a senior advisor to Ithaka S+R, where she collaborates with the Libraries, Scholarly Communication, and Museums program. Prior to her appointment at Ithaka S+R, she worked for 25 years at Cornell University, for the last 10 years serving as associate university librarian, leading strategic initiatives, building partnerships, and facilitating sustainable and user-centered projects. From 2009 to 2019, she led the operations, governance, sustainability, and strategic development of arXiv.org, the open access preprint server for research papers in physics, math, computer science, electrical engineering, system science, and economics. Kent Anderson runs the consulting firm Caldera Publishing Solutions, as well as The Geyser, a subscription newsletter covering the information economy. Over the course of his career, he's been the CEO of an analytics company and has held key publishing roles for many nonprofit journals, including Science and the New England Journal of Medicine. He's a past president of the Society for Scholarly Publishing and the founder of the Scholarly Kitchen, which became the official blog of SSP. Okay, so do we have the votes all in? Okay, if everybody will stop voting, then we will now begin by hearing from Oya.
Well, good afternoon. First, I would like to thank Rick for organizing and inviting me, Kent for being brave enough to argue with me, and all of you for being here. A preprint is a scholarly paper that precedes the peer-reviewed published version. For some disciplines, such as high-energy physics, the tradition of sharing preprints goes back to the 1950s, before the internet era. However, uptake has been slow in many disciplines due to differences in research and publishing cultures. Nevertheless, preprints are gaining momentum among the scholarly community. It's important to note that not all content distributed through so-called preprint servers are preprints. About 50 to 70% of the papers submitted are eventually peer-reviewed and formally published. If you look at the arXiv webpage, this is exactly why the service is described as an electronic archive, e-print repository, and distribution server for research articles. I believe that services such as bioRxiv, arXiv, SSRN, and ChemArchive, just to name a few, are contributing to the advancement of the scholarly communication system. I would like to share 4 arguments to support my position. First, preprints enable rapid dissemination. Peer review continues to be highly valued to ensure the quality of scholarly record. However, it's a time-consuming process. On average, it takes 4 months. Publishing an early version of a paper allows peers to recognize the ongoing contributions and increases readership. For instance, NIH encourages investigators to use interim products such as preprints to speed dissemination and enhance the rigor of their work. Scooping, which is stealing ideas, is one of the top concerns of those who have second thoughts about preprints. Actually, it's just the opposite. Preprints provide a defense mechanism by putting a stake in the ground and establishing priority. Number 2, preprints help level the playing field. They are free to submit and free to read. This is especially essential for many scholars from institutions or countries where they cannot afford publications that are behind the paywalls. Preprints are not aiming to replace formal publishing. Nevertheless, this early and open sharing gives those who cannot afford an opportunity to participate in the scholarly exchange. Some preprints servers have the potential to contribute to the fulfillment of public access mandates, especially as transitional strategies for small publishers that are not ready to support open access yet. 3, preprints are a part of the scholarly communication lifecycle. The concept of scholarly record is broadening. There is an increasing emphasis on sharing various outputs from the initial investigation to the final dissemination stage. Understanding how ideas evolve into knowledge is critically important. Preprint services enhance bibliodiversity and are complementary to journals. They can offer several tangible benefits for editors and publishers. Some publishers are working with preprint services such as arXiv, bioRxiv, and SSRN to explore how to connect published papers with the preprint versions. Also, preprints allow the dissemination of scholarship that is not historically covered by traditional journals. For instance, negative results, baseline but otherwise routine data, preliminary findings, methods and protocols, and short reports from projects. 4, preprints foster innovation in scholarly communication. There are opportunities for linking preprints, their published versions, and the underlying and supporting data and information. From an editor's perspective, preprint services can provide platforms to scout upcoming work and invite the submission of suitable manuscripts to their journals. Preprint servers and journals may enter partnerships to facilitate easy submission of papers. Another example is an overlay journal, which is based on a peer review layer leveraging the existing preprints infrastructure. In sum, I remain positive about the role of preprint repositories in enhancing the scholarly communication landscape and complementing peer-reviewed publications. However, I have a long list of impediments that we need to continue to explore and address, many of which are general concerns that might apply to other open scholarship initiatives too. So let me mention a few within the constraints of my brief presentation. 1, sustainability. Many of the existing preprint services lack a durable, scalable, and transparent business model. Availability of the Center for Open Science preprint technology has significantly lowered the entry barrier. However, running a successful service requires holistic socio-technical and managerial approaches. It is not sufficient to have access to readily available repository architecture. 2, quality control. Only a handful of existing preprint services have a basic screening system in place to ensure that the materials submitted are relevant and valuable to the discipline served. By no means these QC processes are at the level of peer review, and it should not be. However, there ought to be some transparent and consistent content standards and systematic quality control procedures. 3, best practices and interoperability. There are a number of open issues related to metadata standards, licensing terms, and publication ethics. How do we link preprints with the relevant publishing infrastructure and long-term preservation systems? What are the implications of assigning DOIs to preprints so that they are linked to the full publishing history? How could preprints foster diversity and equity in scholarly communication? In sum, it's important to acknowledge that not all disciplines lend themselves for preprints. We need to be mindful, as technologies may have negative or unintended consequences, with potential impact on how we create, validate, share, and archive knowledge. It's essential to understand the characteristics of different scholarly communities and associated preprint services as we try to make overarching claims about the value of preprint services. Well, enough opinions from me. Let me turn it over to scholars and conclude with a recent Twitter exchange among 3 scientists. Aaron writes, "Reading preprints transports me back to my undergrad days before I knew which journals were important and decided what to read based on pure interest. I do appreciate evaluating new work without bias and baggage of where it's published." Fatma responds, "Very true. Not to mention super fast access to new results. You just have to remember, it hasn't been reviewed, and apply your own critical filters. But you should do that anyway, even for peer-reviewed papers." And Melee chimes in, "Preprints are so valuable as many of us work for universities without deep pockets and without institutional subscriptions to the vast number of journals." Thank you.
Hi. Do you have the clock? Okay, ready, set, go. What does it mean to improve the scholarly communication system? Assuming the system is large and includes stakeholders outside academia, let's address that question by talking about 4 things that don't improve it. Pushing out preliminary and untested information in a way that makes it harder for students, practitioners, and researchers to know what to trust. 2, creating initiatives that draw money from other scholarly entities or require injections of outside money, including money from proven bad actors in the information space. 3, confusing the public by allowing them to find unvetted and even abandoned works via search and social, and to have these look more or less official to their untrained eyes. 4, fooling journalists into reporting unvetted findings as if they were solid, verified, peer-reviewed reports, and to have these drafts of papers, some of which are never endorsed via peer review or editorial review, used to inform the world, in some cases creating unwarranted health scares, in others downplaying developing stories, and in others forcing journalists to debunk these unvetted findings. These things do not improve the scholarly communication system. It's important to remember that we are in a very fragmented, polarized, and unpredictable information distribution system. Each of us lives in her or his own filter bubble, a hall of funhouse mirrors, constructed by search engines and social media companies selling advertising against our disorientation and frustration, who provoke fight or flight at every turn and profit from it. Distribution is no longer a matter of certainty. Google demonstrated this once again recently by changing its search algorithm to promote original reporting over secondary interpretations. The fact that this had to be done, or could be done, reveals how much power these intermediaries have in shaping what people see. To drive their ad businesses, misinformation is actively promoted by these companies because it generates more clicks, hence more revenue. We don't have engagement, we have enragement. As a result, we've experienced 20 years of craziness, anti-vaccination beliefs which have led to thousands of deaths, elections like Brexit and the 2016 US presidential election, both distorted and rigged by hostile powers, climate change deniers delaying policies that might help ameliorate the effects of global warming, and an opioid crisis that was fueled in no small part by the manipulation of search results and social feeds. We've even seen flat earthers, people who argue passionately that the earth is flat, reemerge. With more scholarly information available for free than ever, we've seen anti-science attitudes proliferate. Clearly, access to papers is not strongly correlated to fostering a scientifically literate society. But what about preprint servers? To me, they represent negligent information management and are therefore part of the problem. One might reasonably conclude that a preprint that has never been published in a peer-reviewed journal after 2 to 5 years has been effectively rejected by the scientific community or abandoned by its authors. Hundreds or thousands of these orphaned preprints should be a cause of concern, for they represent a potential body of abandoned or flawed works available for amplification if the ad-driven media intermediaries so choose. Yet these archives of rejected or abandoned drafts are maintained on preprint servers available to anyone. For the preprint servers I've analyzed, between 30 and 50% of preprints never result in a peer-reviewed publication. Instead, these draft unreviewed papers are left in the open to be indexed by Google and fed into Twitter and Facebook. Recently, the New York Times wrote a story based on a preprint that had been posted more than a year earlier and which has never been published in a peer-reviewed journal. This paper had to do with a divisive political issue. It was presented as a paper in a way that clearly led one well-informed reader I spoke with to believe it was a peer-reviewed publication. The resulting story may affect how people think about a big issue down the road. The news article represented original reporting, so it will be promoted more strongly by Google now. Yet scholars have yet to critique or approve of it. It was just a preprint the authors posted. Does that reflect good scholarship? Is that helping the scholarly communication system? Excuse me. A preprint from 2016 was at the center of a brief panic about cell phones causing cancer. The preprint has never been published in a peer-reviewed journal and has been refuted by the American Cancer Society. Other unreviewed preprints have fooled experienced journalists into covering hypotheses that border on magical thinking. One of the most cited preprints in Wikipedia is years old and has never been peer-reviewed. Does that improve the scholarly communication system? The public is being misinformed because of preprints. People are finding rejected or abandoned papers and having these reported on as if they are legitimate peer-reviewed science. On top of this, we have a distribution system that tilts toward the provocative, with preprint servers making the supply of information less reliable and more provocative at the same time, playing right into their hands. Altogether, this undercuts scholarly communication's mission and purpose of sharing verified reports and fostering trust in science and scholarship. Preprint servers say they want to promote conversation and improve the papers prior to publication. They accomplish very little of this, with only 8% of papers on bioRxiv getting substantive comments, with no facility for peer-to-peer exchanges on most other preprint servers, and with a majority of preprints posted at a point in time that would allow for peer review to have already occurred. In an analysis of more than 1,200 preprints with corresponding publications in Nature journals, I found that most were posted as preprints after submission to the journal that would ultimately publish them by weeks to more than a month on average, with this delay increasing over time. This does not reflect well on our self-management. Already we have seen our inability to manage predatory publishers lead to blistering journalism around the globe, a major Federal Trade Commission case, and a black eye for the industry. When I describe preprint servers to friends of mine outside the industry, they're shocked we're playing fast and loose with unreviewed and in many cases rejected manuscripts. In their minds, we are no better than the other forces exploiting the public's attention in their own self-interest. Preprint servers don't make a positive economic contribution. They are a drag on the scholarly economy. Cornell has to spend millions each year to cover the cost of arXiv, and even then, arXiv has had to ask for donations from the community recently. bioRxiv had to take millions from the philanthropy controlled by the CEO, chairman, and majority shareholder of the social media company most associated with election interference, social engineering, and psychological manipulation. Other organizations either take philanthropy or spend their own money to support preprints. Those that don't, like PeerJ, have begun to shut down their preprint servers, leaving hundreds or thousands of preprints on the open web with no quality control. Preprint servers don't generate profits that go back into the scholarly economy to pay for the future. They take money available now and use it to pay bills. Speculating on other risks of preprint servers doesn't take a lot of imagination. Pharmaceutical companies want to operationalize publication plans. This means seeding early findings so they can cite them with more assertive findings later on the way to drug approval. Papers that have DOIs and branded interfaces with names like medRxiv seem like good places to start placing draft papers and generating citations favorable to their business goals. Preprint servers are a scandal in the making, and the early signs are there already. It took 10 years for predatory publishing to boil over into an FTC action against Omics. It seems clear to me that it's only a matter of time before a preprint is covered by the media, promoted heavily by social media, used to promote bad health or social policy, and results in unnecessary fear among the public. Oh wait, that's already happened. There are currently tens of thousands of candidate preprints available, preprints with no associated peer-reviewed publication, which look for all intents and purposes to have either been rejected by their community or abandoned by their authors, or both, with hundreds being added every day. There's a final, more subtle subversion caused by preprint servers, the subversion of editorial review and peer review. By granting authors wide distribution, permanent identifiers, social and online promotional opportunities, and a branded interface, preprint servers remove many of the incentives for seeking peer review and when working with editors on a solid, final, sound version of a paper. Peer review becomes optional. When something that takes time and energy is optional, getting your car inspected, for instance, it becomes rational to avoid having it done. Do we want a rational choice for scientists and scholars to be skip peer review and editorial review and get most of what peer-reviewed publication would offer anyways? We live in a period where trusted information is more valuable and important than ever, where quality control prior to publication is more vital to a good information landscape. The costs of confusion are all around us. Preprint servers add to the confusion, do little or nothing to add to the refinement of scholarship, and draw millions of dollars out of the academic ecosystem. They disrespect peer review, they disrespect editorial review, they enhance the dangers of the current information age, and they waste money. Preprint servers do not improve the scholarly communication system.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with Kent about the perils of misinformation and the value of trusted information sources. However, I do not share the intensity of his concerns about the dangers of preprints. Let me elaborate. First, beyond preprints, the ability to find trustworthy information has been a perennial problem at the heart of information literacy efforts. My colleagues at bioRxiv recognize the risks associated with posting unvetted and potential dangerous information very well. Therefore, all articles are screened on submission. I must note that I find Kent's critique of preprints a bit science-centric, positivist. There is a range of disciplinary preprints involving social science and humanities disciplines. Some papers might be potentially embarrassing for their authors for exhibiting poor scholarship, but would be hard to call them dangerous. The role of peer review in maintaining reliability and validity of scholarship cannot be underestimated. Nevertheless, peer review process itself can have potential pitfalls too. It might miss significant errors and might involve unconscious and intentional biases. According to a recent Nature survey, more than 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiment, and more than half have failed to reproduce their own experiments. Kent is rightfully concerned about financial aspects of preprints, arguing that they further strain limited resources. We are indeed facing serious sustainability hurdles as the scholarly communication ecosystem evolves. However, we cannot single out preprints in this grand challenge. Some argue that there is sufficient money in the system. US academic libraries together spend about $7 billion on resources. We just do not know even where to start in redistributing resources. There are some valuable models emerging that promise to be more financially durable and scalable. For instance, ChemArXiv is built on a partnership involving the world's 5 largest chemical science societies. Newly established Political Science Preprints is a joint venture between the American Political Science Association and Cambridge University Press. By the way, just to set the record straight, Cornell does not spend millions on arXiv each year. Very wishful thinking. Only covers about 10% of arXiv's direct expenses. But that's another debate I would like to take on with Kent later.
Oops, sorry. Ready? My counterpart asserts that by posting a draft paper as a preprint, a scholar or scientist can make a claim and establish priority before that claim receives peer review, and that such unreviewed claims partially validate the expenses and risks of open preprint servers. I disagree. When is a claim a claim? By custom, claims are validated after peer review. The patent system, the journal system, and the legal system all seem to agree that peers and/or experts must review something before it becomes a claim or precedent, via patent inspectors, editors and peers, or judges, juries, and grand juries. Just posting a claim to some platform that barely examines the paper before allowing it through seems unlikely to hold up under scrutiny or if contested. Accepting claims which have not been stress tested by peers subverts peer review itself. Peer review and editorial review are the backbone of science and scholarship, just as grand juries, patent inspectors, and building inspectors are vital to stable systems of law, IP, and construction. We have to responsibly manage our interface with society. None of these systems is perfect, but the imperfections argue for improving them and tightening processes in rigor, not skipping them. Rather than preprints leveling the playing field, they tilt the playing field toward unverified and untested claims. Who knows how much confusion is being caused in Tier 1 and Tier 2 countries by preprints? Are we serving these rising nations by giving them 30 to 50% of the time the equivalent of information cast-offs? Publishers have scaled major programs to provide access to Tier 1 and Tier 2 countries to final peer-reviewed reports as well. That's a better solution and actually levels the playing field. Where is the vocal and unyielding support of these approaches? Most scientific findings don't need to be reported quickly. A few months between submission and publication is fine in the vast majority of cases. When something demanding an urgent response occurs in the world, do you really want a preprint? Or do you want a journal to pull out all the stops and get it peer-reviewed by top experts, edited by experienced professional editors, illustrated by medical and scientific illustrators, and published in 5 to 10 days? Journals can do this, and journals do this. There's no problem of any importance that a preprint can solve with comparable quality. The logical fallacy that preprints allow distribution of negative studies becomes apparent when you contemplate my counterpart's parallel assertion that journal editors benefit from shopping preprints for promising papers. If an author is hoping to have their paper discovered, they are in the same incentive game as any journal submission process. They are going to plump their claims so they look appealing just as they would for submission. By logical inference, my counterpart has conceded that exaggerated and untested claims in the public sphere may be the result of preprint servers, which is something we don't want. My counterpart outlines the downsides of preprints in anodyne terms that I believe mask problems that are far more serious. I'll let you decide that for yourself. Finally, my counterpart offers anecdotes while I offer data. I believe the data around preprints outweighs 3 cherry-picked quotes from people with no last names, no orchids, and no identified roles in science or scholarship. You can read my article about a lot of what I've said here in a peer-reviewed paper that was just published in Learned Publishing. It took a few months, but the paper is better for it.
All right. We will now open up the floor to comments and questions. Please come up and use the mic. You've got to be kidding me. I cannot believe that nobody here has a question or at least a comment.
Speechless.
Hi, I'm Helen from Sage in Product Management. So my question is to Kent, what would you propose as a solution for the issues that preprints are trying to solve if we don't do it that way?
So I've written 5, and I think there are more ways that preprint servers could actually function in a way that's responsible. One would be you don't open them up to the world. Preprints the term even preprint confuses lay people. Who I've talked to, they've said, you mean it's not just between peer review and publication, but it's actually before peer review? I was like, well, it doesn't sound like it. So I think if you had a space where people with domain expertise could come and look at papers that are drafted and where there would be actual tools to comment on those papers, then you would actually start fulfilling it. You would design a system that would be built for purpose. I think what has happened instead is that due to a lack of funding, due to a lack of discipline, that a lot of the preprint servers are just basically servers. And that's a mistake. I don't think the public should have access to preliminary data. I think that would be the first line I would draw. And then you also shouldn't have a DOI, because these should be temporary, right? Why do you have a digital object identifier that's permanent on something that is philosophically temporary and changeable? So you wouldn't have that. There'd be a whole bunch of different engineering decisions that you would make if you accepted that, if you really embrace the premise that preprint servers are supposed to be a place where authors can get feedback from actual peers.
Another question for Ken. So you seem to place a lot of faith in peer review, but for instance, one of the articles that you mentioned, the one that led to concerns about vaccines, wasn't that published in a peer-reviewed journal? So that's not really an argument.
Well, but it's the exception that proves the rule, right? So
Well, no, it's not really an exception.
Actually, so a few things, right? So let me, because I've thought this through. I had 10 minutes and 3 minutes. So I don't mean to cut off your question, but I think I know where you're going with this. So that I was there. I was working at the American Academy of Pediatrics when that paper came out in the Lancet in Wakefield. All sorts of consequences came his way, right? All sorts of responses were made by the American Academy, all sorts of accountability. The paper was retracted, his medical license was taken away, all of these things, right? But what happened was that Google was just starting to really blossom at the same time. And they grabbed onto the misinformation from Jenny McCarthy and a whole bunch of other people and absolutely swamped the field with misinformation. There was no way, that was the first time that intermediaries actually took over the communication landscape and distorted it in the way that I'm worried is now going on every minute of every day. So, the result of that was that people who are accountable became more careful about peer review because they learned the lesson. You have on the other side a paper that was NIH funded, a study that was NIH funded about cell phones and cancer risk. It was not approved by any peer-reviewed journal. The author, because he wanted to prove to his NIH funders that he had done something, posted it on bioRxiv in 2016. It's been there for more than 2 years. It caused a health scare for months. It was in the New York Times. People were writing about it. And it has never been taken down. I was just talking to the NLM person who's now they're going to do a pilot of indexing preprint. She's going to index it.
No, she didn't say that.
Yes, she did. She
I
said
was-
yes.
She
said yes.
they weren't necessarily even going to do retrospective.
Well, she said
that
if
was
it, if
her
it were
answer.
No, her answer was if it were published today, it would be. If it were posted as a preprint today, the answer would be yes.
I think
so.
you're-
That was her answer. So there. And where's the accountability? So the American Cancer Society has refuted this paper, and where is bioRxiv saying we're going to retract it? We're going to, where's the accountability? There's no accountability. So you had, yes, there was a mistake with pediatrics. I was at the American Academy of Pediatrics when it happened. They did policy statements, all these things. So the real culprit in that was bad peer review at the Lancet, agreed. But then Google taking that, so that's an exception. So peer review is not perfect. I totally agree with that. It can be far better, but abandoning it is not the way to solve that.
Yeah. Well, I barely got to really, you kind of broke into my whole question there, but I guess the more I read about peer review and the more I see peer review happening, it sounds like peer review itself is broken. It's not just a few exceptions. And the other thing I wanted to note is that in some fields, conference proceedings and so forth have been the accepted scholarly communication for decades and decades. It's not peer-reviewed journals. So the idea that somehow the peer-reviewed journal is the gold standard in every single field is false. So
Okay,
I think, are you talking about medicine? I guess I would agree with you if you're talking about medicine and you say you're coming from the American Academy of Pediatrics. That's not the same as computer science or engineering.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just saying, it feels like you're taking one specific field, medicine, and you're saying that applies to every other scholarly field, and I think the scholarly fields are all very different. So
They are.
I'm just encouraging you to think outside the medicine box.
Agreed. One of the papers that I cited, a preprint that was inflated by the New York Times and then by Google, was a social science paper. Another was an electrical engineering paper. So they're out there. The issue is, and peer review is not perfect. There's also, I think people forget to talk about editorial review, which is actually, to me, more important for a quality journal than peer review in many cases, because you actually have a point of accountability. And I think the biggest problem that preprint servers have is there's no point of accountability. When there is a problem, there is nobody, there's no process, there's no person, there's no step to say, you should take this down, it's a problem. It's there, and that's the end of the story. Whether it's been refuted by the American Cancer Society, whether it's been debunked by journalists, and then you start to get into, if there were that point of accountability, then what is it?
Oya, did you want to add anything?
Okay.
I just want to stand up for peer review. I think it's really, really essential. There must be some way of validating what people say, and nobody's come up with a better form yet. And I think what I would say for preprints is it has to be labeled so carefully as draft, and I agree absolutely with what you say, Kent, that it shouldn't be using some of the vocabularies of validated science. And science is not truth. Science is there to be challenged. So something that was published and validated yesterday can be invalidated by research published tomorrow. That's the process. But you should make a distinction between what has been validated and what hasn't. And I don't feel that preprints quite have found that clear mark yet.
Does the scope of this debate include preprints that appear on institutional repositories?
It's a good question because the debated premise was preprint servers.
I would say not, because my whole answer is predicated on high levels of discoverability, DOIs, structured access, things like that.
I'm Linny Argabright. I'm a library student at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I have a question for Oya. I think that's right. Oya, sorry. So I was wondering if it was possible or desirable to remove or notify on a preprint server whether the article has been published or not published.
That's an excellent question. You know, given the fact that preprint services, the existing preprint services, are either benefiting or being kind of limited with their infrastructure, their technology, and the resources, I think there is not one definitive response. But in an ideal world, given that there are no resource limitations, yes, it should be possible. Just that I have firsthand experience with arXiv, it's really a matter of really a resource limitation to be able to follow preprints, to be able to check them. There are not yet really reliable metrics and interoperability standards to be able to constantly check preprints or check published version. And actually, there's a pretty important study going on now that is supported by ASAP Bio. It's a scholarly communication research group from Canada. What they are doing is they are looking at preprint metadata, and they're also highlighting the deficiencies. So, I mean, as I said, overall, I do believe the value of preprints. But again, I want to highlight that I think it is really unhealthy to generalize them across the fields and also across the preprints. I have concerns about some of the preprints myself, which I try to articulate.
I think just to elaborate on that, and to the point of my friend who I rudely cut off earlier, and I apologize, the issue with preprints, I was talking to somebody in Frankfurt, and this industry's arguing about two things, you know, it seems, or distracted by two things, open access and preprints, but nobody can define either one of them in a way that everyone agrees with. And you know, it's interesting, the same thing is with peer review. Peer review is practiced in different ways by different journals. I would just underscore, I think editorial review is one of the most undervalued and important things that we never talk about because it's not a process. And the one thing about an engineering era is everybody wants to talk about process, but what it actually sometimes comes down to is judgment and taste and experience and knowledge.
So, Adam Chesler from AIP Publishing. And I don't know if this is an easy one to answer, but most of this discussion is focused, I think, on distribution and dissemination of content. And I'm wondering, has there been a study? Could there be a study? Is there any evidence indicating that the quality of that final version has been affected by the preprint process? Have those, whatever you want to call a final version, is it over the past, the archive's been around for 20 odd years, can we determine that content in, whether it's in journals or wherever, is better or worse because of the accessibility or availability of preprint servers?
Well, I think this gets down to the difference in fields. So when you get into astrophysics, one of the reasons I think, and maybe Oya will agree or disagree, that arXiv made a lot of sense is that it came about in an era where the machines that were doing astrophysics started to throw off data faster than the humans could keep up with it. And so it became really a handy tool to kind of throw stuff out there quickly, and then the scientists who really wanted to write a paper would be able to say, okay, this, they'd be able to talk amongst themselves and say, okay, this 50% is what we should really put in the journals. This other stuff's kind of preliminary and kind of, or whatever, not that interesting. And so I think probably because of that, I don't know if the quality of the journals got better, but I think the ability to handle the information improved. What I've seen, though, with those in the biological sciences is that authors have already caught on that this is a game, and that they are now posting preprints after they've submitted it to the journal that's ultimately going to accept it, and in the majority of cases, and doing that right now about an average of 40 days after they've submitted it. And I've done papers, and I've been a peer reviewer, and 40 days is enough time to know, A, that you're going to get published there, B, that you've gotten peer review feedback, and you've probably gone through 1 or 2 resubmissions. You might even have the final copy. So if that trend continues, then preprint servers are basically just going to be an institutional repository on steroids of final author drafts. And that will mean that they haven't done anything to improve the paper. They're basically reflecting what peer review has done.
Just if I may add, I really am not aware of any studies, except for maybe a couple of disciplinary, to look at the relationship between quality going either side. But what I want to note is maybe something we haven't mentioned is that preprints now, and I think are going to be increasing the like journals, that some of them will have reputation, credibility, and trust, and some of them will not. arXiv.org gets 600 submissions a day, and that there's a quality control mechanism. 95% of them go through the quality control mechanism involving 170 moderators all around the world very quickly, and 5 of them will have some problems. There will be delays in posting it. You would be amazed the number of complaints that we get at Cornell that would go all the way to the presidents, because having your preprint on arXiv, especially if you're a large group, is prestige. So I want to kind of highlight that it's very nuanced as we are discussing black and white here, and as you can hear, Kent and I agree on certain points too, but in this regime of preprints, now that there are more than 3 dozen, it's still a very kind of a new space. arXiv paved the, in means of leadership. However, arXiv had a huge advantage. When Paul Ginsparg came up with arXiv, there was already a very strong tradition of sharing preprints in high energy physics. And that you may know that with Center of Open Science or anything, there's always either prefix or suffix of arXiv. And that I remember the Cornell Council once contacted me and said, what does it mean for Cornell? What is the liability, because they are using arXiv's quality or the name recognition. And that I had some very interesting conversations with my colleagues who are starting new preprints and using prefix or suffix of arXiv, because they said, oh, arXiv is now a standard terminology. It means preprints. It indicates quality. So these are some of the issues we haven't discussed so far, but just wanted to kind of mention that preprints is still an evolving field, and that there are rightfully some concerns, but still it's going to be scientists, scholars, carefully understanding and thinking about which one is good for their reputation building. Otherwise, I agree, they might be yet another institutional repository bucket there if they don't have that trust, recognition, and prestige.
Hello, I'm Annalisa Taylor at the University of California, San Francisco Library. And Kent, you were talking about the issue of accountability and that there is a lack of accountability with preprint servers because they haven't gone through peer review. And what occurred to me is that in some ways you could say that the accountability is the fact that you are opening up this research to the world. So I think most scholars would not want to actually put their work out there if they don't think that there's some validity to it. So that's kind of a comment, is that there is that potential for those comments. But although I know that there aren't a lot of comments typically to articles or to manuscripts get posted as preprints. And there was a question that follows that is, in the case of this article about the risk of cell phones, were there a lot of comments in particular on that preprint of people saying this is not valid or so forth?
So let's see, what was the first part of your question?
She had a comment.
Right,
Yeah,
the
it was-
comment on,
yeah.
so as far as the cell phone, so how that got busted was more from a journalistic standpoint. And then comments came in after the journalist pointed out that this was a problem. So it got amplified by some journalists, it got amplified by social media, it got amplified, and then journalists who were smarter than journalists in the first round said, hold on, and they looked at it and they said, this is a problem. And then the comments started to come in. That's my recollection of what I've looked at. So I don't think that there wasn't early feedback on it that led to it. And again, it still is there. You can go look for yourself and see what the dates are, and you could look at Google journalists and all this kind of stuff. But to the point of, and I think there's a truth to power kind of aspect to this too, that journals tend to trust authors, to your first comment, because they believe that they're operating in good faith. Journals and peer review processes and all that can be fooled by authors who are operating in bad faith. There have been huge scandals around cancer research, around materials research, all sorts of areas where you just have really, you have bad faith actors. They are probably in the preprint space too. For instance, the cell phones one, the guy, again, he knew the study he had to know the study didn't turn out as he wanted, but he had $25 million in grant money. He had to do something for the NIH. The major journals told him, no, we're not going to publish that. So he's like, well, I got to do something. At least I can dump it here. And it's still sitting there because, again, there's no accountability. American Cancer Society has a whole page about don't believe this preprint. To me, that's one of the most glaring examples, but there have been others, and there will be others. And there are probably those that we don't know about now because, again, the volume is so high. The miss rate is, 30 to 50%. So, I think there's a problem, and again, I just don't see the benefit. So if I'm looking at a cost benefit, I don't see the benefit. All I see are costs and risks, pretty much.
And then a question open to everybody is, have there been any studies that you know of that looked at those 30 to 50% of papers that actually don't get published? It seems like it would be a little bit difficult to do this, but just to try to do some assessment of like how valid or how sound at least their science is. And I also just wanted a little comment on that, is just, it seems like this is somewhat akin to the predatory publishing issue of just content that gets published in journals that have questionable peer review practices. It might be that the published content is just fine, or it might be that it could have been rejected by peer review. And how is there a way to sort of do some sort of assessment of that questionable content or unknown content?
I don't know of any assessment. Do you? Yeah. So one of the things, when I was a young pup in publishing, one of the editors who was senior at the time, and now rest his soul, he said basically, get used to it. 30% of the papers that we receive should never be published anywhere. And I went to other journals and learned that measure is actually pretty reliable. There's about a third of the papers that really are just terrible. They're bad ideas, they're badly executed, they're bad data, they just shouldn't be published. So it was really interesting to independently see that on bioRxiv, it's 30%, 30 to 32% of the paper, of the posted preprints never get published, because it's like, there's that number again. And, you know, I think that it's just, if you have high standards and you believe in, you know, well-done science and well-done studies and well-done research, that a third of the time it just doesn't work out. But it was just interesting to see that same number again. It's like, huh, there we are, same thing.
I just want to add that I'm not aware of any studies either, but again, I want to highlight that preprints are not as pure as we consider them to be. And again, you know, arXiv being the leader in preprints, if you look at arXiv pages, especially user guides, you would not read preprint. It's always called ePrint or distribution service. And that this is not really answering the question, but there is a study that I know, I think by now it's 7 years old. It looked at all the fields in arXiv and tracked them when they were, if they were published, what was the gap, so on and so forth. And it was quite interesting because, again, it's so disciplinary. In condensed material physics, 85% of them got published, whereas in computer science, I think 25%. It doesn't really mean, it really is so much about the scholar communication culture of these communities. So again, I just want to highlight that as we talk about preprints, it's not as homogeneous as we would like it to be.
Sorry, Doug. So I think we are about out of time, so the time has come for us to take our preliminary vote, our follow-up vote. And so following the instructions on the screen here, we'll invite everybody who, and again, only please those who voted the first time so that we're actually measuring the same population. Please go ahead and register your votes, and then we'll be ready to declare a winner. And while we're waiting, Kent will sing a song for us.
That's right.
That would make me the winner.
If I had a piano, I would. I'd do a mean Elton
Are
John.
you a musician too? Yeah, he can.
All right, so in the preliminary vote, 80% of respondents agreed with the resolution and 20% disagreed. Our final vote is 38% disagreeing, 38% agreeing and 62% disagreeing. So the winner is Kent. Congratulations, Kent. And thanks to all of you for coming and participating. Thanks for your comments, and thanks for participating in the process.